William, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll let you take it away. We'll mute ourselves, and it's all yours.
Great, thank you. It's nice to be here. Yeah, Jason and I met a few years back on a really fun brass quintet tour going down south, specifically in around Atlanta. And yeah, a little bit about me. I live in New York. I specialize in new music. That's probably what I'm primarily known for in places. But everything that I do in the new music realm is based out of like an understanding of the classical tradition. And like my entire warm up, which I'm not doing for you today, is all based on classical technique and classical tone. It was always, there used to be like this old thought that I used to see all the time, or I used to hear all the time, that people who did new music were like people who had like kind of given up or couldn't make it. That used to be like kind of an old like trope about the new music musician. Or it was just kind of assumed that they were people that couldn't like hack it in some way. Or the third thing was is that in order to develop all these modern techniques, you needed to like give something up about a classical sound. Like you needed to ruin your sound to get these weird sounds. I reject all that. I don't think any of it is true. And I think that you can program Bach and Xenakis and a world premiere and like a David or a Saint-Saëns like back to back on a recital and really do them at the highest level possible. Like you don't need to give up anything in order to acquire new knowledge. So today, ooh, plastic alto P-bone. I have one for my kid too. Today we will be going over extended techniques, but none of this is replacing, working on your own shoes. It's all just additive. Like it's all just more knowledge that we get to learn and play with. Um, yeah. So I have four different techniques I'd like to focus on. There's multiphonics, split tones, really florid multiple tonguing, like multiple tonguing that's like not just the way that we classically approach it on repeated notes, but how to do multiple tonguing more like a violin score, like violins would do the ricochet effect, and lip trills. And the lip trills and double tonguing are actually connected. So, should we start with the multiphonics or like the lip trills? Which one do you think? Yeah. First
I'd go
person.
from Multiphonics. The multiphonics I heard you doing when you were warming up was like unbelievable. We were doing a sound check and I was like, what is that? It was really cool. So I want to know how you did that. That was awesome.
So there's like a couple things to know about multiphonics. Just I really like having an understanding of what's happening physically so we can really work on the individual elements. When we play trombone, our lips buzz, but our vocal box doesn't buzz. When we sing, our vocal box is resonating, but our lips aren't buzzing. But you can combine those two things because you have two separate sources of pitch generation, your vocal box and your lips. Multiphonics are the art of combining those two into one pitch or into one effect, which you can further go in a lot of different directions. Like you can play them independently. You can even do stuff like fourth species counterpoint all on your own. It's kind of neat. But the effect is you do your buzz, you do your singing, and then you combine them. That's what it sounds like without the trombone. If anybody can whistle, you can get something similar happening because you could whistle and hum. Whistle with your lips, hum with your vocal box. So those two elements are important. The best way I've found to tell people how to develop them is to take the trombone and to sing an F. To sing that F. Now we are just singing, not playing. You just want to sing an F, you can get a reference pitch, and then sing that through the horn with your embouchure. Try that a couple of times. Make sure you can really feel that. Your embouchure set, but your lips not vibrating. So we want to get the feeling of the sung note, and the sung note through the embouchure, because we're singing into this tiny, tiny, tiny hole. And then we want to get the effect of our playing, so that we have all these separate elements, the singing through a tiny hole, and the playing ready to line up. Now, as we sing, this next time, see if you can add your lips vibrating into it. So sing and then start vibrating your lips on the low B flat. Now, this doesn't work for everybody. It's one of two ways to approach it. The other way is to play the low B flat first and then add the singing above. You can actually, sometimes I put my hand here to feel the difference. Does everybody feel comfortable or have any questions on that? Great, one question?
I got one question.
Sure.
I've done some multiphonics before, and one of the things that I've noticed then and now is that sometimes I start coughing uncontrollably. Like it tickles my throat in a way that just makes me cough a lot. Is that a sensation that you find goes away with acclimation, or is it something I'm doing?
It goes away with acclimation, and it could be that you're pushing the voice too hard. You want a really relaxed, open singing style. You don't want to try to balance the voice with the trombone, because the trombone's going to be louder unless you use a harmony mute. You really want to focus on a relaxed projection of just and what you can do is you can open your mouth and kind of close it in the embouchure position to see just how much resonance is cut off. So when we try to get the full sound of our singing, but we do it through our embouchure, it actually becomes very stressful on the throat. So we need to know what our relaxed singing voice is and what it feels like to sing through the tiny, like, vibrating embouchure. Now, once you get that first step, there's a lot of stuff you could do with multiphonics. One of them is vowel coloration. So if we take our sung F, I, E, I, O, U. If we just sing I, E, I, O, U, you can start to hear how it affects the timbre of your voice. I, E, I, O, U. And the really elongated U is kind of neat because you can hear this kind of sweep of partials. Now, when we add that to multiphonics, if I do the same sequence to the horn, you're going to hear some lovely colors pop out. So you can start to get some really interesting colors. Everybody want to try that out? Give me a thumbs up and I'll share some more fun multiphonic knowledge.
Can I just ask a question real quick? And maybe this is just because I haven't really worked on it so much, but I feel like when I start singing, it's sort of, since maybe that's vibration is taking up some of the airflow, I'm getting less airflow to my lips. And
Yeah.
that means is that just something you have to kind of get used to, or is there any, is that
I
a,
get used to it when it becomes a fully integrated technique, like when you can just start picking up the horn and just going. You'll start to notice a difference when it becomes like more and more adapted. But you do have less air overall because the air required to push out the voice on top of the buzzing. Like you can totally expel your air and you can still play because your lips resonate. But when you want to get a full sound and a full multiphonic on top of it, it's just going to take a little bit more air than normal. So
okay, thanks, that's great.
Yep, the one vowel I'd really like to focus on, the one that I think is the most useful for techniques, is the E vowel. Ah, ya, ya, ya. So just take a second and switch between ah and E, just singing for a second. Ah, ya, ya, ya. Now, what's really fun about that is you can actually do it on just a played pitch. And you can kind of create a rhythm mixing between ah and E. Now, when you have your ah, your tongue is like this. When you have your E, your tongue pushes up towards the front of the mouth, if this is the front. Ah, ee, ah, ee, ah, ee. And you'll feel that when you play. And Jason put a good point in the chat. One really great thing about extended techniques is once you know how to do the wrong things on purpose, you can fix kids who are having issues with the wrong things, and you can tell them how to avoid it. Like a double buzz is just a split tone that's uncontrolled. And if you know exactly how to create a split tone, which we'll get into next, you can use that knowledge to kind of fix that issue in a younger player. Now, with our multiphonics and our ah-e, we can create a rhythm with the ah-e tongue and add in the multiphonics on top. So you can kind of become like a one-man band. And you can have a lot of fun combining all these techniques in interesting ways. But for the multiphonics, it's good to remember that our voice and our lips buzz independently, and you can practice singing through the horn to get the feel of it until you really integrate the techniques. If you're really interested in more basic knowledge, my partner Jen Baker wrote a book on multiphonics. The first one that exists is called Hooked on Multiphonics, and I'll drop that name and book title in the chat for you all. And I highly encourage you to pick it up. It's like a 150-page book or something about that. That's all about multiphonics, how to perform them, how to write for them, how to use them. Covers a lot of ground. There's a couple other cool things one really fun thing in a multiphonic etude I wrote for myself is you can do fourth species counterpoint, where the trombone and the voice move independently and offset from each other. And I can show you that now. Because once you get the feel of multiphonics, you can start to move them independently. And you can start to do that. Another really fun thing you could do with multiphonics and the E tongue is if anybody's familiar with Folk Rabe's Basta, there's a really long section of multiphonics where you play a sixth and the trombone slides up a half step and the voice slides down a half step and you land on this really nice perfect fifth, like this. So we'll have the top pitches are sung, the bottom pitches are played. And you do that by slow glissandos in the top and the bottom. One thing I always felt about this section of Basta is it goes on for a while. You're doing just like that sequence for like 30 or 40 seconds, which is a really long time in classical music to be doing anything. So one interesting thing you could do to make it more interesting, Basta's already pretty interesting, but there's this little special sauce you can add on top of it, is you can add an E tongue in the middle of the multiphonics. So you get this really cool kind of sweeping spectral effect that feels like it really lands on that. You go, and you use your E tongue in the middle during the glissando to try that. Yep. So that can be a really fun thing that once you get comfortable with the multiphonics and adding vowel coloration upon it, you can start to do some really interesting stuff with existing rep or your own rep. You can create your own songs, your own rhythms, your own melodic patterns. Yep. Oh, the other really important thing to remember is Barrios Sequenza has a moment where you just sing and you play two phrases underneath that most people just completely leave out or forget about. And specifically, it's on the second page about halfway through where you go, you play those notes and you end up singing a high G sharp. And as you're singing that G sharp, Barrio leaves space in between two short glissando phrases. So you actually sustain the singing, but you take your buzz on and off while sustaining the singing. So. And you can practice that by holding your song pitch. And having your notes come in and out over time. Yep, it's like patting your head and you can do the same. When you do the singing thing, you can just kind of play whatever notes you want as long as you take your embouchure on and off and you take your buzzing on and off while maintaining your embouchure. So whole world of like multiphonic techniques out there. Jen Baker's book, Hooked on Multiphonics, is really good for that and seeing even more. Any questions about multiphonics before we move on to like the boogeyman technique of split tones? Yes.
I have two small questions about it. First of all, voice crossing. I've never been able to get the voice more than a semitone below the horn.
Yep.
Is it
tricky?
Is it just something that just comes after a while?
When you have to take a nice fifth in a comfortable singing range. I find that for most, there's a difference. It's like a F to F, F3 to F4 is like the common tone among voice types for men and women, generally assumed. So you want to find a note that's comfortable for you. I'll show you this one on an E flat, which is a little outside that range, but feel free to transpose it as necessary. If you want to sing that note and play a pitch above, I would start on either an octave above or a fifth above, maintaining the tone and then adding in the voice. Now the voice really, when we think about singing low, we usually think about opening our jaw, which is the opposite of playing high, where we think about our embouchure being really firm. So what we need to do is develop the relaxed tone, and you need to just work on singing through your embouchure. In the most relaxed quasi, like go on the quiet side too, just more of like a hum than even a big singing voice. And then what you want to do after that is play, I'm going to take a fifth up, so I'm going to play the B flat a fifth above that E flat. And you want to play the B flat really quietly and then add in the E flat almost like a quasi hum. So you don't want to focus on the singing right now. You just want to focus on very quiet singing. And then you maintain the B flat or an octave. Which is a little trickier because again, the embouchures are flipped and it's harder to do that. And that is one way to work with it. Multiphonics beneath the played pitch, I find in 99.9% of cases are harder and just take longer to develop. But it's just one of those things where you just do like 5 minutes a day of multiphonics, and in like a month, you're going to be pretty comfortable. It really only takes about 5 minutes. And also it's very stressful in the voice because we're basically all untrained amateur singers who have to like scream really loudly through this tiny hole to make it sound anything like the trombone. So 5 to 10 minutes is like pretty good unless you have something really important coming up because you're just going to shred your voice pretty quickly. I'm almost
there's a
demonstration.
In William Craft, I think there's a point where you have to cross the harmonics, the playing and the harmonic. That always got me. I could do both sides, but I could never get them across each other.
Yeah, it's tricky. If you did like a glissando.
Yeah.
You can kind of work on that if you do a glissando from like F to B flat and try to sing the opposite in the voice. And once you get comfortable with both techniques, singing above and below, then you can start incorporating that. There's going to be a lot of catches at first. Like there's going to be a point where like snaps over rather than crosses smoothly. But that's okay because almost nobody ever notices. And if you can get it, you can get it. We're not looking for perfection here. It's a multiphonic. Yeah.
I keep having, sorry, can I just ask a quick question? I feel like as I'm just working on it now, I feel like if I get the balance right with the singing and the buzz, I often feel like I'm having to sort of back off a lot on the voice. Is that kind of what you're observing? Or
I have to project the voice even more than the trombone, but everybody's experience is individual. So either one of these is definitely valid. Yeah. It's like extended techniques become highly personal at a certain point, but there's like ways to develop them and there's tools you can have to learn them, but it's all going to be like what ends up working for you based off of the advice you get. Like, you know, the same with any set of teachers that you've had in your life. You pick out the good stuff, you leave the rest behind. or keep it just in case it's useful for somebody else. All right, so split tones. This is kind of like one of like the like boogeymen of like the extended techniques. What split tones are a simultaneous buzzing of two adjacent partials in the partial series. The bottom lip and the top lip are buzzing different pitches, which results in a compromised interval between the partial series. So if I take a B flat and F, and I do a split tone on those adjacent partials, you hear all this beating and roughness in the sound because the embouchure is compromised in both directions and it's a little narrower than a perfect fifth should be. It is what also gives it its really distinctive rough character that's different than multiphonics. if I play the same two pitches as a multiphonic with the F on top. If I play it with the B flat on the bottom. And if I play it as a split tone, you're going to get 3 different timbral effects, which is really cool. Now, split tones personally took me 7 years to really get good at. I've never seen anybody else take as long as this, so don't be worried if it doesn't happen at first, but also probably don't expect it to take 7 years either. The European trombone soloist Mike Svoboda, he showed me the technique for developing it. There are 2 primary ways I've seen of approaching split tones. One is to bend a pitch down until you get in the middle of the partial and try to find that point where it catches. And that's one way that people have used. To be honest though, it's not my favorite, and I'd like to focus on a different way of approaching split tones, which kind of ends up sounding a lot cooler when it works. So we're going to take our middle F. Everything comes down to the basics here. It's always just like playing one note with a good sound and then learning how to apply the technique on top of the good sound. And it's just all. Anybody watch Christian Lindbergh's Taiwanese hotel warm-up video? Christian Lindbergh went over his warm-up routine. And it's like, everybody's like, oh, Christian Lindbergh, what's his warm-up routine going to be? And he just sits there and he compares his breath to a violin bow. You draw it back and then you play like that. And his whole warm-up routine is just going. It's just that in every position. So it always, always, always comes back to the basics with a good sound and a fundamental approach. Split tones are no different. We want to play our F. And this is our baseline. This is like kind of our barometer. We're going to start from playing a classical, traditional, really beautiful, best possible sound F. Now what we're going to do after that is you're going to take your jaw and move it up and in, almost like a bulldog, like an underbite. Not that extreme. But there's a point where you try to maintain the tone of the F. Try to maintain the tone no matter what. That's the most important part. And move your jaw slowly up and in while maintaining tone. If you do it right and you spend enough time on it, there's a point where the split tone starts to sneak in without really compromising the timbre of the F. So you can kind of hear how the split tone sneaks in underneath. The first time I did this, it took me about 45 minutes of just holding an F and experimenting with jaw pressure just to see what happened. But again, you want to slowly, slowly, slowly move your jaw up and in while trying to maintain tone on the F as much as possible. When you do it right, it kind of sounds like magic at first. It sounds really cool because you can just really sneak in this other tone. You're like, where'd it come from? And after it's established, I like to come back out into the full classical rich tone again. So you play the note, experiment with the jaw to have the split tone come in. And then back out for the tone. Yeah. Anybody have any questions on that? Or did anybody have any like rapid success with it? Because that would be cool. This one definitely takes a little bit of time. Like, you just do that a few times a day, just experiment with jaw pressure, and eventually you'll find the point where it double buzzes, which beginners do quite naturally. And then you could learn how to control exactly where you want your jaw to be. My warm-up every day, I do the very first exercise of the Schlossberg book every day. So I just sit there and I do my long tones. Just that. When I get to the sequence that starts on F and high B flat, I add a split tone into the second of the 3 pitches. So after I develop the split tone, I incorporated it into my warm-up in the Schlossberg book as a note, split tone, note on the 3 articulations, kind of like the Caruso 3 articulations. I know he did 6, but I'm just narrowing it down. Now, the reason I did this in my warm-up is I never want to compromise my original conception of sound by doing a technique. So I always make sure that the first and third notes are that, like, you know, Charlie Vernon's school of like project your perfect sound, hear it in your head before you play it. That's my first and third note, and the note in the middle is the split tone. So it's always about maintaining the richest possible sound in as many ways as possible, and then adding the extended techniques on top of that as a way of just kind of widening your sandbox and having more things you can play with in the world. Yep. Not a replacement for any other technique or any other tone. It's just it's an addition. It's something fun you can work on. So again, move your jaw up and in really slowly and see if you can find that point where the split tone sneaks in. I find that you can also bring the mouthpiece down physically a little bit. You can do that sometimes to find a split tone too. Not necessarily the way that I learned that gave me the most control, but it's a way to get acquainted with the technique. Now, one other cool thing you could do with split tones is when you play them in the high registers, crazy things happen. Like crazy uncontrollable things. You can get a noise that's like white noise or like radio static if you just set, like, I like to call it, like, you set your embouchure to like stun or as high as possible. As much back pressure as you can and as little airflow as you can. It's like playing an oboe just into a trombone mouthpiece. You get some really cool sounds. It's not everybody's favorite sound in the world, but it is one that you can use and you could do on the trombone. For a long time, I was really, I saw a lot of modern trombonists started doing like effects pedals and computer programming and all this other stuff. And I just thought to myself, like, can you get those same sounds on the trombone itself? Do you really need to have like a pedal board of 30 pedals to play your piece, or can you like get the sound? Turns out you can kind of get the sound of a lot of these things. You can get a lot of cool sounds. And again, it's based off of like that split tone or shut down your embouchure, maximum tension, minimal airflow. Now, one of the really fun things you could do with it is you can take like a classical note, again, and you can go in the split tone noise, you can go in the white noise sound, you can go into like crazy avant-garde sound, and you can come straight back into your classical tone in one breath. So. You know, you can do some fun, weird stuff. It's the more that we can show people that the trombone can do lots of things, the more we're going to be asked to show to do a lot of things, which, you know, trombone needs to be taken a little bit more seriously than it does. And this is just one possible step in that direction. All right. Any questions about split tones? Because there's two other fun things I'd like to share with you. Yes.
Really quickly, William, I noticed from my split toning, I've had some embouchure issues over the years, and I've been working on kind of, I don't want to say changing it, but improving it.
Yep.
So I used to get split tones quite a bit. I just called it double buzz. But what I've noticed now, kind of after this talk and kind of experimenting, is that like the lower left side is definitely like the low B flat area, and I feel a left versus right kind of sensation when I'm doing it.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah, I hope it helps you have like another. What's really interesting about these extended techniques also is that they are great diagnostic tools for working with students. When you know how to make your horn sound like garbage, you can tell your students how to like come back into the sound world you need them to develop first. And then you could tell them why like one man's trash is another man's treasure and why the garbage sounds are actually really cool. So a lot of us have worked with multiple tonguing before, and we've heard all sorts of multiple tonguing. But when we hear multiple tonguing, it's generally on like one pitch or one scale pattern. And we might hear something like Chartis once in a while. So we're used to hearing double tonguing and triple tonguing in these classical patterns that trombonists have used. But we can do much more with them than we realize we can do. And we can do a lot more florid patterns and a lot more like virtuosic, even beyond Flight of the Bumblebee virtuosity, if we start to train our lips to do these things. And we could do that with triple tonguing, we could do that with double tonguing. And we could do so much more than just the back of the Arbenz book. And the back of the Arbenz book is great, like the Brilliant Fantasy. We can do all sorts of stuff that's in the back of the Arbenz book. And we can learn our stuff up until the point where the Arbenz book ends, which is just going to be like repeated notes and scalar patterns, and maybe once in a while like that bopping down, which is much easier on the valves. But we can do all of this on trombone too. So what I like to do when I first developed this technique was to take the major triad that's in first position from B flat to B flat. And start to learn how to do that as a triple tongue. Da-da-ga-dum, da-da-ga-dum, da-da-ga-dum. So I would just focus on just doing a triple tongue on the B flat first. And then see if you can take that same triple tongue pattern and just go straight up, just bounce straight up to the high B flat. So just start on the first B flat. And then put a lot of energy into the first note and bounce up like a trampoline. And once we start to learn how to do that, we can do the same thing coming down. Sorry, I spend a lot of time developing like really high register stuff, like 2 octaves above that B flat, because my idea for a long time, and it took like a really long time to develop, is that once you could play like an octave above or an octave and a half or 2 octaves above, like high B flat, bolero, it's just not scary anymore. So like the high B flat just feels like a middle register note at this point, and it's not because I have any special talent. It's just because like the way lips work and the way that our instruments work, especially if you listen like the Claude Gordon method or something, I think there's a lot there, means that anything that any brass player can play is just a long-term adaptation of time to how the lips buzz. Like you can play lead trumpet screaming notes on trombone if you use the same embouchure that the trumpet players use on a trumpet. The embouchure for every note on every instrument is exactly the same. Like this note, if you play that on any brass instrument, you will get that B flat. If you play that in a tuba, you'll get that. If you do this into a piccolo trumpet, that's still going to come out. So what that said to me is that like anything that like a lead trumpet could do or a low tuba could do, you could do on trombone too. You can just play screaming high trumpet notes because the embouchure is exactly the same, and it's a long-term adaptation over time. It's like a marathon, not a sprint. So with this multiple tonguing, I tend to do it in the higher registers because the partials are closer together, and it just takes some time to get used to articulating in that range. So you just have to give yourself some time to do these new techniques, like months, if not like a year or more. And it's okay, like we have that time. It'll make other parts of your playing better as you work on it. So it's all about like, it's a marathon, not a sprint for picking up these techniques. So I just thought it was important to like talk about that for a second. So when we have our up and our down triple tonguing, which is developed just from our single tonguing, once we get comfortable with those, we can just start going up and down and up and down. And you don't even need to cross positions. You can do it with one hand, you know. But once we get comfortable with both of those, you just connect them. And from there, you can start to move the pedal point of the slide. Once you get comfortable with that, all you're doing is just moving the slide a little bit and focusing on the bottom note. And you just kind of learn how to take that same technique and just change the pedal point of the note. So that's like the second technique of that. And you can also do, you can just go down in the slide in all 7 positions. As another way of kind of getting used to the technique changing over notes. Because it's not the tonguing that trips us up when we start doing these more florid things, it's the centering on the pitch. So we just learn how to really quickly center our pitch and then let the multiple tonguing ride on top of it. And once you do that, you can start doing patterns that get wider and wider, like Avro parts fratres for cello. Once we get that pattern and once we get our triple tonguing and we can really center each note super quickly, once we get that centering and that vocal and that tonguing technique, you can really start to apply it in as wide of a pattern as you can. But it's always just developing it from that very first. Or if you're doing double tonguing, Which is actually going to connect to my next technique that I'm going to talk about. But you can just take B flat D F in one position. And further, you can isolate the K tongue on the D and just make sure that that sounds as open as possible. If I use my traditional 2 tongue, I want to get my K tongue to try to sound just as good. It doesn't sound just as good, but if I do the T and the K, I want to try to even them out as much as possible. So everybody take that D and just play a couple of articulations on the T syllable. And then try the same thing on the K syllable or the GU syllable, whichever that you choose to use. And try to make it sound as even as possible or as close to each other as possible. One of the secrets for working on multiple tonguing is isolating the K tongue as much as possible. So when you do your T and then your K, when you feel good about it, then it's going to be easier to go. And make it sound like notes, not just like a wash of sound effect. Cool. So that's like the floored multiple tonguing stuff. Like the Arben's book is great, and then going beyond it with these techniques makes the Arben's book easier. A lot of my warm-up and a lot of my techniques came because I used Joseph Alessi's warm-up, and the only thing I did differently was I didn't stop where he stopped in the writing. So like he has his 2-octave arpeggios for building range, and they stop at a high F. And I just thought to myself, like, why not keep going? And like a year later, that started happening. And then like 2 years after that, like that started happening. And it was just a matter of like keeping the ideas of always coming back down with a good classical sound and just not necessarily stopping where people tell you their warm-up stops. It's just try stuff. Just try to keep going because nothing bad's going to happen as long as you maintain your sound. If you find that like you're doing arpeggios or anything that goes into extreme registers and you can't come back down with a good sound, like if I was doing and then I couldn't come back down with a good sound, something's gone wrong. But if I could do the same arpeggio and come back down, balance is also good when you start developing things like this. Every time I do a multiple tonguing technique, I always go back and do very easy lip slurs after. So I'll do my exercises like that, and then right after them I'll just do with just air. We do something that goes in the extreme high register, you want to follow it up with something that goes maybe down into the pedal register. Whenever we do something that's like super fast tonguing, we want to stop with like a vocalese or something really easy flowing, because you have to remind yourself to play all the different facets of the trombone when we work on these crazy techniques. So we're not just developing a technique that lets us get good at one thing at the expense of others. Yep, Jason?
I would imagine, with a lot of the students that I work with, even at the college level, and I think that I have some maybe colleagues and myself, are guilty as well. We tend to start with the same thing, and then we go through the chapters of the book that we kind of have in front of us. And then we always put the most extended or the craziest stuff in the last chapters that we don't often get to as frequently. But it sounds like what you're really talking about is, kind of balancing it in there and purposefully going, you know, maybe like a very traditional, very, you know, standard kind of a thing. And then you throw some extended and then some standard and then some extended and then some standard to make sure that it's just kind of built in balanced in terms of the way that you're approaching it. And I feel like that's kind of a pitfall for a lot of practicers.
Yes, it's all about coming back to the music of it. It's not about the technique itself. It's about learning the technique and then making it musical on top of that. So I think that like those warm-up books, in between every exercise that's hard or in between every exercise that's in the back of the book, there should be like the very first chapter again. Because you can do all these crazy things, but you should always come back to like a you should always come back to like a roshu. Just remind yourself to sing, especially in the trombone world. We're going to get paid basically off of like 90% of the time off of how good we sound in the classical stuff. And the other 10% of the time can be really exciting. And if you spend enough time on it, I've kind of made a career out of it. But really the rate of like return on it is pretty low. So you need to keep your classical chops in first and foremost of your mind at all points. You need to be able to sit in that orchestra or sit in that Broadway pit or sit in that big band and sound the right way. And then have cool stuff you could do to show people on top of it when your own projects or when it's applicable. Yeah. I think the last thing I have to share with you is lip trills. Now, we usually work on the lip trills again with an Arbenz exercise where we do like quarters, eighths, triplets, sixteenths. And we speed it up until we get to the point of a lip trill. Generally, we see it in like the higher notes, like the David concerto. And we see it in those things. But I asked myself, like, why just do lip trills in the high ranges? And why just do lip trills by themselves? So we can take our lip trill, like let's say between F and G. And if we're having a hard time with lip trills, you just do that slow metronome exercise until you can speed it up. And I find a little bit of jaw motion actually helps you access lip trills at first until you can minimize it and your tongue takes over. Because your tongue controls pitch more than your embouchure. But that's a whole different story. You can get a really crazy like lip trill sound like that, but eventually you can even it out. So that there's minimal jaw motion. But you can use a lot of jaw motion at first just to kind of cross over and figure out how to do it. Now, there's two things that I've done with lip trills. One is I've brought them lower and lower and lower and lower. So you have like, you can do your lip trills up there in Stravinsky, but if you keep coming down the partials, now it gets interesting when we start doing the lip trill on the fourth between F and B flat. And then even more interesting when we start doing it between the B flat and F. So we can do lip trills of the same speed as long as we just bring them down lower and lower and lower. And there's actually a cool extended technique piece, Tim McCormick's Heavy Matter, which has a few, not a lot, of those low lip trills where I'll have you do like plunger and some really high stuff and then just go into like a low lip trill. So there's like a whole kind of cool sound world you could do. By developing these lip trills in different registers. Also, if you could do a lip trill on a low B flat and an F, a lip trill on a high B flat and a C feels a lot easier. Because it's the same motion, just smaller and smaller and smaller. So the lip trill becomes less of an issue than the embouchure strength becomes. So when we work on low lip trills, they're tricky. But they are possible. And again, this is another thing, it just takes time experimenting. And
Yeah, how long did it take you to get that second to third partial? I'm just curious.
When I heard it done, I had already been doing enough new music for a while, so I probably learned about this maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and that one didn't take a very long time to develop. There comes a certain point when you spend enough time in like new music Candyland where you've kind of seen everything. And like I've played so many pieces that have been written for me where I have to like decouple techniques on the horn or like read an independent line for buzzing, an independent line for slide, an independent line for harmony, and an independent line for pitch. That eventually like the volume on the hard stuff just gets turned down.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's long-term adaptation. I
Right.
started getting into like Xenakis and Barrio on my own in undergrad because I've never really had a trombone teacher, to be honest.
Yeah, we talked about that. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just kind of left on my own, and like I found music, like modern music, started really speaking to me because I didn't come from a musical background and I didn't have any teachers to like show me the love of Beethoven. Like it just wasn't. I don't think it's an innate thing. I feel like it's a learned thing, and I didn't have that like learning time. But what I did have a pull towards was modern music because it kind of reflects the modern world. So I started doing stuff like Xenakis in my undergrad because nobody told me not to. And after learning that stuff, you just kind of pick up more and more techniques and it kind of snowballs. The stuff that I'm showing you now is like, it's the start, like I'm pushing you down the hill. And then you're just going to keep rolling faster and faster and faster. And it's going to get easier and easier and easier the more you do it. Yeah. But like getting pushed down the hill at first can be scary. Once you do those low lip trills, there's a really interesting thing that you can do. And again, this is like pushing boundaries in ways that I hadn't seen before, but I just started questioning myself where possible. Can you switch between a lip trill and multiple tonguing on the same 2 pitches? So you have your lip trill, and you can multiple tongue those 2 pitches too, which is harder. I came across that because it's harder to multiple tongue across pitches than it is on the same pitch. As you can tell, the one where I'm bopping between the 2 notes is a little less clean. It's something I still work on almost every day. Actually, every day. I think I've taken 6 days off of practice in the last 18 years. And it's partly what I've had to do to get there. Again, like the no teacher thing, but I find that other people all have an easier time with it. So, can you switch between lip trilling and multiple tonguing? Was the next question I asked myself. It turns out you can. So once I figured out that like, oh, I can, it's like, all right, well now I have to do this kind of everywhere because I can't just like pat myself on the back and be done with it. And once you get comfortable with both techniques, the double tonguing and the lip trilling, that's the next step. And I'm sure like a year from now, I'll think of something else that's really dumb that nobody else has done, and I'll just bang my head against that wall for a while and then show other people, and somebody else can make it useful down the road. But it's all about learning these techniques, linking them, and having a curiosity about your own human capabilities. Because like, there's no difference between any of us and Joe Alessi. There's just none. He has lungs, he has lips, he has a mind, he has a heart, I think. Yeah, we all have that. And anything that like one of us can do, all of us, in my estimation, can get there over time. I mean, at a certain point, you're going to run into like the athletics of it, and there's like a reason why the Olympics exist. But for the most part, I think that like 99% of all trombonist technique are capable of like 99% of us. That Lindbergh warm-up video was really instructive to me because he really doesn't spend time like working on Flight of the Bumblebee. He's not like, I wake up every morning and I... No, he wakes up every morning and he just goes, no, that wasn't that good. Better. And he just does that for like 20 minutes. And what he did was he did that over a really long time and scaffolded or added brick by brick all of his techniques. And sometimes we limit ourselves in our own heads. We say like, oh, we can't do what that person does, or oh, I can't do that thing yet, or oh, I haven't learned that thing yet. But you're only going to kind of learn it by giving yourself the permission to try it and figuring out where it goes. And then asking for help, asking for advice, staying really connected to the classical sound tradition or jazz sound tradition. I think that, classical and jazz sounds have become really homogenous in a lot of ways. But always connecting to our own ideal sound and then adding all these techniques on top of it. It's just having curiosity and allowing yourself to explore things that really know, and it's going to be what enriches us and it's really find where our personal limit they are.
Yeah, it almost, even the trombonists that have that more of a mentality of like, well, I'm going to play in orchestras and I'm going to stay kind of in the traditional box and that's where my bread and butter is. I feel like there's a massive psychological gain in if your goal kind of stay in that what would we consider maybe a more traditional pedagogy or traditional playing techniques, to develop these, like those are going to become just so much more easy and just completely understood from both, really benefit from just investing a little bit of time in this way. So when you talked about the rate of return earlier, I might disagree, just saying that, yeah, it might take you 3 years to develop that technique and put that in a, in a contemporary piece, but it's going to make so many other things that you're trying to do so much more comfortable,
Yeah, that brings up two ideas for me. One is that if you want to like make money and be a professional fastest, learn your bolero. That's the money thing. But bolero is easy. It's not that crazy hard. It's just a sequence of notes that happen to lie in a high register. There's no real like trick to it other than like the basic fundamental musicianship skills, which are much harder than executing a series of notes. It is much harder to play in time than it is to do any of these extended techniques. It's much harder to play in tune than it is to play a split tone. So working on those fundamentals will always do that, but then pushing yourself in the technique limits and past where you think is the thing will reduce the things that are hard that don't need to be hard. The second thing that I really like to talk about is, as a community of trombonists, we're used to being in the back of the orchestra. Only one trombonist has ever made it to the front of the orchestra as a full-time career in Christian Lindbergh. And there's like this whole kind of musical hierarchy, like a brass ceiling, to like who gets accepted as a musician. Not just as like a trombonist, not just as a brass player, not as a wind player. If an audience sees a violinist walk on stage for a concerto, they will have a different hearing experience than if they see a trombonist walk on stage. And that's just a sadness of where we are as an industry, because the instrument doesn't make the musician. The fact that you're holding a trombone in your hand, people will hear you with their eyes. They're going to hear something different than if you walked on stage with a cello, than if you walked on stage and sat down with the piano, because of the cultural expectations that not only the music has put on us, like the absence of trombones in most romantic literature, or the sit out 3 movements and play 20 notes and be done, but in also the self-referential teaching model that we've taught ourselves. We've taught ourselves that tuba mirum is the end game. We've taught ourselves that playing an excerpt for 30 seconds is the hardest thing you can do, and it's the ultimate expression of your musicality. And it's not. It can't be. It can't just be that as trombonists, we're only musicians in small doses. We can be musicians anywhere at any time because it's us, not the instrument we're holding. My favorite saying for this is like, if you gave Yo-Yo Ma a tuba, he would still be Yo-Yo Ma. He would still be a musical genius, but nobody would know his name. Nobody would have ever heard of Yo-Yo Ma if he played tuba. We have that guy. His name is Oystein Bodsvik, and almost nobody in the world knows him, even if he gave a TED Talk performance once. There's a lot of lost musicality in the brass world. There's a lot of personal expression and techniques that we can develop and share with people that we haven't accessed or asked ourselves to do because it's not the thing that we learn to make money. So these questions about personal exploration, about technique exploration, it's all about exploring the musician you can be versus the musician that we hear others be. Steal music. Take music from oboes. Take music from flutes. Take music from violins. Work on like the Schumann romances. Work on vibrato. Do the Bach cello suites with like a lot of weird stuff. Just explore stuff and see what works for you. Not every Bach cello suite needs to have the we don't all need to play like that. There's no reason to play like that. You can do so much with this stuff, but we have to ask ourselves, and we have to get out of the box that people see us and expect to hear, and that we tell ourselves we should hear like, we should sound like, and we should look like. So these extended techniques, they're just all about breaking down boundaries between yourself and your instrument, and yourself and what you can show the audience, and yourself and what you thought you could do, and what you actually are capable of. Cool. Any questions? Any thoughts? Can have some sharing time. Yep.
Yeah, it's more sort of a statement on that. I think everyone's sort of stuck in this orchestral world. I mean, last year I had to play William Kraft, Hans Zender, Stäbler, on top of normal orchestral dienst. I mean, Hans Zender, whoever's played the Winterreise, it's one of the scariest moments in the orchestra, just having to pop out a high F sharp and out of nowhere.
Nice. Yeah.
In the middle of a 45-minute concert. So I think that the idea of playing the orchestral player isn't any longer just playing Beethoven and Mozart. I mean, in 1 year, I had 12 living composers on the stand.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, living composers write a lot of challenges, but really, if we look back at it, like, nothing is been hard to Berg 3 pieces for orchestra. And that was like 100 years ago. We haven't gone, it's like it's time to ask ourselves to go further and develop these techniques and tones and access the music that's within us rather than the music that we're told we're supposed to play. I always find it really funny that high schoolers learn the Saint-Saëns Caventine, and when you actually go back to the Saint-Saëns Caventine, it's a much harder piece than like a lot of concertos. It's really tricky, but we're told it's like a beginner piece. I never understood why like the Saint-Saëns is like technically more difficult than like anything up into the Creston, and yet it's the high school piece. Why don't we use the Saint-Saëns as a jumping off point to develop harder repertoire or more florid repertoire, or really push ourselves to see what we can make like lyrical like that? Like that's kind of a harder pattern than like La Gazaladra or like David or like anything in a lot of these pieces, and yet it seems the high school piece. So we limit ourselves at some point for some reason. It's just worth thinking about. Oh, I do have one really fun bolero trick though. I like this one, and I'm just as much as I've talked down about bolero, it's still all really lovely. Like I love all this music with all my heart. It's just not a stopping point. In the second section of bolero, if you keep your half steps on the same position, this part, there's a much, much, much easier way to play it if you keep your half steps on the same position and you just slide out. And you end up on E in fifth position. It's going to be a lot easier. It takes some time to get used to because it's not our normal thing. But there's so much less slide movement. Let's see. It locks in really nicely, and it will make bolero much easier. Yep, that's my one thing. Extended alternate positions work really well. The more so symphonique, if you just do it in all alternate positions, and you keep your half steps on the same partials. Actually becomes much easier and much more lyrical to play than trying to cross all the partials. You avoid all those little pops. And the bolero thing follows the same thing of keeping your half steps on the same partial so they sound smoother and you don't get the pop of crossing the Yeah, looks easier, ends up being easier on purpose. That's my bolero trick. Figured I'd leave us with something really classical just to balance out all the extended technique stuff because that's what we have to do, balance.
That's really awesome. I actually have a quick question. Is there any repertoire you could recommend for starting to unpack some of these techniques? Because you're mentioning Xenakis, but I'm actually not familiar with a lot of this stuff. Any recommendations?
Yeah, let me drop a bunch of names in the chat. They all have solo trombone pieces. So you have like Xenakis, Berrios, Chelsea, Stockhausen's in Freundschaft, Cage solo for sliding trombone, which is much more theatrical and extra musical, not in an extended technique sense, but in like a extended technique is theater sense, which is something we also have to develop. When we start doing these solos and stuff, we need to be soloists on stage. We cannot just like, you know, if we're playing a solo on stage or if we're playing and there's like our music stand and we're just like, it's really boring. When we do solos on stage, we need to actually, what separates Lindbergh, for example, is his stage presence and the fact that he sounds utterly remarkable and invested as a performer. Check out his recital that he posted in Japan from this last January. He still plays circles around anybody that was at Tchaikovsky competition in any round. And Lindbergh's almost 60 years old, or he's over 60 now. He still plays circles. When we play solos, we need to be a soloist. We can't just like horn angled down, kind of looking over the top sometimes. That doesn't really invest confidence in the audience. When we play solos, when we work on this rep, extended techniques or classicals, we need to be out. We need to be on stage. We need to be in front of people. We need to perform more. And honestly, the same way that I talked about with the extended techniques and the high registers and everything else, we need to practice performing. We can't just like get up on stage every once in a while and like play as if we were sitting in a chair, but we just happen to be standing. When we do solos, we have to be a soloist and we have to develop those skills, that stagecraft, the ability to talk. All the stuff that I'm doing now, it needs to be the performance. And we need to practice doing that. If you're presenting modern music to a new to you audience, you need to have something to talk about and you need to give them investment in what you're about to perform. You cannot just expect the piece to speak for itself unless you know you are in front of the most knowledgeable audience, which is pretty rare. Like you basically have to go to like Darmstadt or like a hole in the wall in Lower Manhattan where 6 people will show up to know that you don't have to talk about your pieces if they're modern music. Something about the piece, something about the composer, something about your personal relationship to the music you're about to perform. Pick one of those 3 things and talk about that for every piece you're about to perform. When I present Yannis Xenakis' Karen, his solo trombone piece, it is an extraordinarily difficult piece. It can be a hard piece to listen to for people who don't know the style. I have things I could talk about with each. Xenakis' life was fascinating. He had half of his face blown off in World War II while leading the Greek resistance. His own government sentenced him to death in exile. He escaped to Paris. He became an architect. He had no musical training and eventually ended up studying composition with Messiaen. I can talk about all of that and explain why Xenakis is interesting as a human being and what you're going to hear that represents his experience in his music. In particular, he had half of his face blown off, and he writes really austere mathematical music, but he also leaves spaces for these beautiful, beautiful melodic phrases. And to me, that represents some armchair psychology of he's capable of writing beautiful music, but like his own personal beauty was taken from him, he gives you these moments and then takes them away and replaces it with something harsher. When you can tell an audience that before you play a difficult piece, they will listen for it and they will thank you for it. I can also talk about how my own personal relationship to the piece was. I'd never felt a connection with the classical tradition growing up, but I felt a connection to modern music because it represents the modern world. So modern music was my lens into classical music. And the fact that this helped me find my place in the world due to the connection that like he uses 20th century mathematic techniques that we can find in computers. I can understand that because I understand computers more than I can understand what high society was like in the days of Brahms. If you could talk about the fact that you have a personal connection with your music, if you could develop one, you give your audience something to listen to. Again, the audience is going to listen with their eyes and they're going to listen to the story that you tell them just as much, and it is just as important as the piece and the way that you play. So you need to have as many different things to give them as possible, whether it's something about the piece, something about the techniques you're using, something about your personal journey, and then you need to have your classical sound and your extended technique sound. They all need to be aligned. And then you need to perform on top of that. And we don't get to a lot of this in our studies. We get to like the execution stage, and like, you know, you have a recital coming up. What are you going to play? All right, walk on and off stage, play each piece, and then, you know, get your standing ovation at the end. But there's so much more that we can do. There's so much more we can do as performers and humans that we can start to develop. And again, a lot of this is just practicing this. I was a very bad speaker for a really, really, really long time. And it took me just a lot of effort to get to a point where I can speak like this. But speaking like this makes it easier to perform like this also. And it builds. It snowballs. Yeah.
Fantastic, man. So right, and you do some teaching at what, Longy?
Yeah, I teach at the Laundry School of Music. They're doing some really interesting stuff there. You
Yeah.
can audition on whatever you want. You don't have to play excerpts. You don't have to wear anything fancy. You can wear street clothes. We want to teach people to operate in the 21st century music
Yeah,
that we're in.
that's great.
Just like,
You know,
it's a mix of like orchestral background, commercial background, new music background. You need to be flexible. Like you need to play all the trombones now. You need to be able to play every style, every genre. You can't just do one thing anymore. The music industry is not supporting it. So you need to learn how to be outgoing, how to be interesting, how to be provocative in a way that's not like off-putting, but in a way that draws interest. And what we're teaching at the Laundry School is how to develop those skills across multiple instruments, multiple styles, in order to give you the best chance you can at trying to make it in this absurd music world that we're in now, where everybody expects you to give everything away for free.
yeah.
Yeah. There's so many good players out there. You can't just be a good player anymore. You have to do something else. Everybody's scrambling to figure it out right now. Laundry's a place where for the last 5 years we've been focusing on trying to teach it.
That's fantastic. Because I know a lot of schools are stuck in the, and I posted like in the chat, just the academic recital and just the concept of like, you learn your pieces, you play your pieces, you get your, it's like you get your patch on your jacket, you know, and then you move on to the next check, you know, check that you got in the box, you got to check.
There's probably literally 2,000 or 3,000 people who graduate with a trombone degree or a music performance degree on trombone a year who could fit in at least half the orchestras in the country and nobody would bat an eye. And then there's probably a few hundred that can play any chair in any orchestra that are graduating every year from the master's program. Like there's 500 people in this country right now that could take over Joe Alessi's spot and nobody would notice. So
Right.
what are you going to do to separate yourself on top of that? Because you got to get there, but then like a lot of people get there.
Yeah.
What's next?
Well, this has been fantastic. I can't thank you enough for just being, you know, willing to share. And you know, and we go back and forth with the concept of, you know, giving stuff away for free. And in this community in particular, you know, where we kind of fit in and grapple with that. And I know that for, you know, for us in the trombone community, I feel like one of the ways that we philosophically are trying to kind of get through this interesting time is trying to band together as if we are all trying to find a place and keep a place for trombone, you know, and maybe carve out more of a place for trombone, you know, in the community or in the industry. And so we're just very grateful that you're willing to share with us in our journey in that direction.
Yeah, a lot of people, there's a vested interest in not talking about the work because the more talented you seem, the more likely you are to be given opportunities. And that's like been shown through like academic studies. But everybody does the work. Every single last person does the work. Whether or not they talk about it is a whole different issue.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm grateful that you're willing to talk about it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And I definitely
don't know. Yeah. And it's having gone through having no teacher and having to figure this out brick by brick. I really want to make it one of my life's goals that nobody's to feel like that. That they're fighting it hard. I just want to share.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you. I mean, can't thank you enough. And I hopefully, one of the things that we've noticed in the ITH, you know, thing here is that now that schools are back in session, and especially in Europe, you know, they're heading back to work now. So the number of people that are tuning in live is smaller, which, you know, I don't mind. It's more of an intimate setting. But then by posting the video, you know, we do have a lot of people that do go back and watch the videos and, you know, kind of get woke to some new thoughts and some new ideas and some new, you know, not only some new techniques, but even just new ways to, you know, psychologically think about it. And so it'll be interesting to see kind of what we hear back, you know, and how that kind of can maybe create a ripple effect.
Oh,
and
totally.
Who knows? Maybe we'll, you know, you'll get some random calls someday where people will say, "Hey, I've been working on my split tone technique. Can I share it with you?" And you know, we're hoping that it kind of bridges some things together in the long run. So
yeah, I have a few videos up on my YouTube channel that are more in-depth exploration of some of these techniques also. So
Awesome.
Get some questions every once in a while about it. And yeah, please feel free to share my email with anybody.
Great.
I'm here for people.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Will. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate it. I learned so much. Thank you.
And thanks everybody